On a dark night when everyone thought the worst was over, a hidden secret rose from the shadows. In a quiet little village, where everything seemed peaceful, a terrifying truth lay buried. A truth that, when revealed, could change everything. Are you ready to uncover this truth, or will you choose to bury it in your memories forever? The village of Elmsworth shimmered beneath the golden haze of midsummer, its cobblestone paths glowing with the sun's lazy warmth, and the echo of generations-old memories that clung like ivy to its brick walls. The annual summer fair had transformed the usually tranquil square into a riot of color and movement. Striped awnings swayed like banners over stalls piled high with trinkets, baked treats, and bottled nostalgia. The scent of sweet fudge, roasting chestnuts, and polished wood drifted through the air like a spell, luring villagers and visitors alike into its warm, festive grasp. Children darted like sparrows through the crowd, shrieking with laughter, their sticky fingers clutching toffee apples and bright balloons, while old-timers leaned back on benches, nodding at familiar faces, sipping lemonade, and murmuring half-remembered tales to anyone who would listen. But for Miss Alara Merton, seated with quiet elegance at a dainty iron table outside the Silver Thistle tea room, the day was not quite as bright as it seemed. With a delicate teacup balanced between her gloved fingers and a lace parasol shielding her from the afternoon sun, she appeared the picture of genteel contentment, yet her stormy eyes missed nothing. Across from her, the ever-animated Edith Bramley gossiped with the enthusiasm of a woman who lived to collect secrets, her fingers jingling with rings that caught the sunlight like chimes in a breeze. "I swear to you," she was saying, "the Reverend's wife nearly poisoned half the choir with that jam of hers. Rhubarb and recklessness, I call it." Alara smiled politely, but her attention drifted past the chatter. She scanned the crowd with the quiet precision of a clockmaker, taking in the stiffness in Mrs. Halbert's posture, her gloved hands clutching her handbag a bit too tightly. The forced laughter of Daniel Halbert near the cider stand, whose easy grin didn't quite reach his eyes, and the harried figure of Martha Bell, the innkeeper, weaving through the crowd with flushed cheeks and distracted eyes, like a woman trying to stay afloat in a storm, only she could feel. It was subtle, this wrongness, like a dissonant note in an otherwise perfect symphony, but Alara had always been sensitive to such things. And then the moment came. Martha reached their table in a flurry of breath and clinking porcelain, her apron askew and voice just a touch too high. She set down a fresh pot of tea, and gave them both a strained smile. "You wouldn't believe the week I've had," she puffed. "Had a guest, Mr. Carrington. Odd fellow. Very quiet, kept to himself. But 3 nights ago, vanished. Just gone." Edith blinked, then scoffed. "Probably just wandered off. Absent-minded professor type." But Martha shook her head, more serious now. "He left without his coat. His suitcase still in the room. Paid till Wednesday, left Monday night. No message, no goodbye, nothing. And I checked. He didn't take the morning train. Station master never saw him." Alara's hand stilled, her teaspoon resting in the cup, forgotten. "How very strange," she said softly, though her thoughts were already racing. "People leave, they miss trains, they forget things, but people do not simply evaporate, and certainly not from Elmsworth, a village where nothing remained private for long. A man disappearing without a trace, without anyone noticing until days later, was more than unusual. It was unnatural." As Edith prattled on, trying to wave it off with some feeble speculation, Alara remained silent, her mind spinning through the implications. There had been no letter, no telegram, no sighting, only silence. And silence, in a village as talkative as Elmsworth, was as good as a scream. The wind shifted, rustling the bunting strung above the green. Somewhere the brass band picked up a lively waltz, but its cheer felt suddenly thin, hollow, like a mask stretched too tightly across a hidden face. Alara placed her cup down gently, the clink of porcelain barely audible over the music. Something had begun that no one else seemed to notice, and it was unraveling quietly, patiently, like a secret itching to be exposed. A single man may have vanished, but behind his silence was a shadow waiting to stretch across the village. And Miss Alara Merton had just seen the first flicker of its shape. The summer sun cast long, drowsy shadows across the village green, where Elmsworth's annual fair bustled with innocent laughter, and the cheerful hum of a community lulled into comfort. But beneath the gaiety, something darker stirred. Miss Evelyn Marple, with her delicate lace gloves and calm observant gaze, sat primly at her usual corner table beneath the ivy-covered awning of the silver thistle, stirring her tea with such practiced elegance that one might miss the sharp gleam in her eyes that missed very little. Across from her, the ever-loquacious Mrs. Partridge rambled on about the vicar's wife, and some rumored disgrace involving rose cordial and choir practice, oblivious to the storm of thoughts brewing behind Evelyn's serene smile. It wasn't the gossip that held her attention today. It was the quiet mention from Mrs. Thorne earlier that morning, voice low and uncertain, of a man who had vanished from the Red Hart Inn. Mr. Peter Lansbury, a stranger in Elmsworth, unassuming and private, who had arrived with a leather suitcase, polished to a shine, and a courteous nod for everyone, and who, 3 nights ago, had disappeared without so much as a goodbye. No key returned, no luggage taken, no bill settled, a perfectly fine coat still hanging by the door. Evelyn's spoon clinked once against the edge of her cup, as her thoughts turned like gears in an old clock. It wasn't just the absence that disturbed her, it was the silence around it. No one had seen him leave, no porter, no postman, no child with a sharp eye for the unusual, as if Mr. Lansbury had never existed at all. And yet his untouched belongings sat upstairs in his rented room. A letter reportedly arriving the day before his disappearance, one that left him, according to Mrs. Thorne, visibly shaken. Evelyn leaned back slightly, lips curved in a polite smile, but her mind raced through the implications. A man may depart in haste, but he does not do so without his essentials. He does not forget his coat in the middle of an English summer, nor abandon a trunk still latched and gleaming, nor does he simply dissolve into thin air, unnoticed by an entire village, where even the cats have names and reputations. Evelyn knew people, knew their patterns, their silences, the way guilt flutters in a glance, or how fear lingers too long in casual conversation. She rose with grace, mingling through the fare with an ease that belied her purpose. She spoke with the postmistress about weather and stamps, nodded at Mr. Griggs the butcher, paused to comment on the jam at Mrs. Appleby's stall, but each word exchanged was calculated, each smile a nudge, and in return came fragments. Mr. Lansbury had been kind, quiet, distant. He had received a letter bearing no return address. He had looked pale afterward, distracted. No one had seen him at the station. No carriage had been hired. No path led out of the village without someone spotting him, except, of course, if he hadn't left willingly, or at all. It was Miss Evelyn Marple who noted the gap in the milk delivery the morning after. It was she who recalled that the cat who liked to sit by the inn's front steps hadn't been seen either. And it was she, quietly pocketing the final detail from the girl at the bakery, that the letter Mr. Lansbury received had a seal marked not with initials, but with an unfamiliar symbol resembling a serpent coiled around a key, who understood that this was no ordinary disappearance. This was something far older, far colder, and far more deliberate. The fair's music rose behind her, but to Evelyn, the tune had changed. A shadow had passed through Elmsworth, and where it had gone, something had been taken, and she intended to find out what. "It isn't gossip, you understand, Mrs. Elspeth," Wren muttered, as she wrung her hands in the soft folds of her apron, her voice low and eyes flicking toward the ceiling, as if afraid it might bear witness. But when a man disappears, truly disappears, without collecting his belongings, without paying his full due, and without so much as a farewell to the dog that followed him about each morning, well, that feels off, Miss Halcroft. Deeply off. Miss Halcroft nodded slowly, the firelight catching the sharp angle of her cheekbone as her hands remained motionless in her lap, eyes never leaving the elder woman's face. "People may flee their lives, yes," she murmured, but they rarely flee their luggage, their coins, or their clean linen. Elspeth swallowed, the sound loud in the silence that followed. He said he'd pay at the end of his stay. 3 days more he was meant to remain. Only he didn't, and no one saw him go. The words clung to the room like smoke, curling in the corners. Not James at the platform. Not old Tibbin at the crossing. Not even poor Agnes, who cleans at dawn and notices every footstep left on her freshly mopped floor. Miss Halcroft rose at last, her movement deliberate, like a thought forming. And his room, as he left it, Elspeth replied. Bed tidy, window locked, suitcase still beside the wardrobe, untouched. I didn't open it, didn't dare, but it's there, waiting, like it expects him still. The room upstairs carried a stillness far older than dust. When Elspeth unlocked the door and stepped aside, Miss Halcroft entered not as a guest, but as one entering a scene long abandoned by time itself. There were the signs, the whisper of motion stopped short, a glass with the faintest trace of water at its base, a shirt draped neatly over the back of the chair, as if discarded only moments ago, a book opened halfway through, and left upon the nightstand with the page unturned. But most telling of all was the writing desk, its ink pot crusted at the rim, and beside it a page, empty but for an indentation, as if the thought had once begun to form but never made it to ink. Her fingers traced it, and her voice was low, almost reverent. He meant to write something. Something he chose, or was stopped from writing. Elspeth hovered in the doorway, pale now. What could make a man stop mid-thought, leave all behind, and not return? Miss Halcroft's gaze moved then to the chest of drawers. The first slid open easily. Shirts, collars, a book of psalms. The second, the same. But the third resisted. That one's locked, Elspeth whispered. Always has been. Miss Halcroft straightened slowly. To lock one drawer, in a room otherwise untouched, that tells us two things. That what's inside mattered, and that he believed he'd need it again. But he never came back, Elspeth breathed. No, Miss Halcroft said, stepping back as her eyes scanned the quiet corners of the room, as if seeking the imprint of a struggle no one had heard. Something came between him and the return he intended. The question is not where Mr. Grayling went, but what reached him before he could. The air shifted then, soft, heavy and watching, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to ask. For the first time in her life, Miss Elowen Hartley felt a sharp, unsettling certainty. A certainty not that the man had simply forgotten his key, nor that he had left in haste, but that he had never intended to leave at all. Something in the very air of Chipping Hollow had begun to change, and it was there, in the quiet village, that Elowen knew she must listen closely. She had long believed that the best way to understand the pulse of a village was not through idle chatter or village gossip, but through the seemingly insignificant words exchanged by shopkeepers, those silent witnesses to the undercurrent of life. It was at the butcher's shop, in a small corner of the village, that she first overheard the soft murmurings about Mrs. Aldrich.
"Haven't seen her in weeks,"
said Mr. Belling, the gruff baker, as he wrapped a loaf of sourdough in brown paper for her. Not even for her usual Wednesday scones. Sends her boy to pick up the bread now. Strange that. She never missed a day before. Elowen's brows furrowed slightly, her heart quickening with the weight of the words. Grief, she knew, could twist even the kindest soul into something unrecognizable. But this was different. This was a sense of something much deeper, a quiet unraveling of the ordinary, that gnawed at her very core. That same afternoon, she made her way toward the old churchyard, where Mrs. Aldrich was often seen sitting on the bench beneath the overhanging branches of the hawthorn tree, her gaze lost in the sweep of the village. But when Elowen found her there, the woman's posture was rigid, tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her fingers twitching as though she were bracing herself for something or someone she feared. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Aldrich," Elowen greeted softly, sitting beside her, the creaking of the old bench breaking the stillness. The widow offered a tight-lipped smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Miss Hartley," she replied, her voice polite, though it lacked the usual vibrancy. "How lovely to see you. How is your dear mother?" They exchanged the usual village pleasantries. The weather, the latest gossip about the baker's new oven, the upcoming village fair. But Elowen could feel the strain in the air, the unspoken tension that neither of them dared to acknowledge. It wasn't until she casually mentioned, as though it were an afterthought, "I hear there was a gentleman staying at the Windmere recently, a Mr. Caswell, I believe," that the silence that fell between them became palpable. Mrs. Aldrich froze, her breath catching just enough for Elowen to notice. It was only a flicker, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. The widow's voice when she spoke was too quick, too rehearsed. "I don't know him," she said, her hands tightening around the edges of her shawl, the fabric pulling taut. "I've never met him." Elowen's gaze never wavered as she kept her tone neutral, almost disinterested. "Oh, I was under the impression that you had spoken with him on the village green a few days ago." The widow's jaw tightened, and for a moment Elowen could almost hear the woman's heart racing. The silence between them deepened, fragile as spun glass, each breath held in the space that seemed to stretch longer than it should. Then, with a sudden jerk, Mrs. Aldrich stood, smoothing the folds of her dress with exaggerated care, as though to escape the weight of the conversation. "I'm afraid I must be going," she said, her voice now brittle and thin. "There's much to be done at home." She gave Elowen a brief hollow smile before turning sharply, almost hurriedly, toward the church gate. As she reached for her handbag, Elowen caught the tremor in her fingers, the brief, involuntary movement that betrayed her calm exterior. A woman doesn't flinch at the mention of a stranger, unless that stranger is someone she knows too well, or perhaps someone she wishes to forget. That evening, Elowen walked to the post office, under the pretense of purchasing a few stamps. The familiar scent of ink and parchment greeted her as she stepped inside, and Mr. Cartwright, the postmaster, looked up from his ledger. "Ah, Miss Hartley, something for you today?" he asked, his voice warm with a hint of curiosity. "Just stamps, thank you," she replied with a practiced smile. She hesitated for just a moment before adding, almost absent-mindedly, "And I wondered, did any letters come through for a Mr. Caswell, the gentleman staying at the Windmere?" Mr. Cartwright scratched his chin thoughtfully, his eyes narrowing. "Caswell? Now that you mention it, yes. There was a letter, came a few days ago, but it was returned. Said the man wasn't there to receive it. Odd, that." Elowen felt a pang in her chest as she steadied herself. "Returned?" she asked, her voice smooth, though her mind was racing. Mr. Cartwright nodded, leaning in slightly. "I returned. The innkeeper brought it back to us. Said the gentleman had left, gone somewhere else. But funny thing, there was no return address on it, only a London postmark." Elowen's mind clicked into place, the pieces fitting together with unsettling clarity. A man disappears without a trace, leaving behind only a letter meant for no one. A widow, whose demeanor shifts like sand beneath a storm, her fingers trembling at the very mention of his name. And now a letter with no sender, only a cold, indifferent mark from a city far away. There was something far deeper and darker at work here than mere coincidence. The more Elowen thought, the more the village of Chipping Hollow began to seem like an elaborate web, each thread tugging and trembling with secrets that no one dared speak aloud. Something was happening beneath the surface of this tranquil, seemingly innocent village. And though the mystery had only just begun, Elowen knew that the answers were buried in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. The strange disappearance of Mr. Caswell was only the first step, and she had the feeling it would lead her into depths she was not yet prepared to face. The game was afoot, and there was no turning back now. Mrs. Whitmore had always been the epitome of grace, a woman whose composure never faltered, even when faced with the deepest of misfortunes. The untimely death of her beloved husband, the whispers of village gossip, and the usual array of scandalous affairs that plagued the small town of Woodbridge. But Miss Marple had noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor in recent months, a quiet unraveling that hadn't gone unnoticed. Gone were the morning walks through the village square, the kind greetings exchanged with shopkeepers, the gentle invitations for tea that had always been so effortlessly extended. Instead, Mrs. Whitmore had all but vanished from public life, her presence now a mere shadow behind the imposing wrought iron gates of Whitmore House, which seemed to close tighter with each passing day. The townsfolk, naturally, took note. "She's not herself," Mrs. Partridge confided one morning, as she arranged fresh roses in the churchyard, her brow furrowed with concern. "Always so friendly before, but now, she hardly says a word to anyone." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her fingers adjusting the lace on her gloves with measured precision. She had learned long ago that the smallest changes in routine were never insignificant. They were often the first whispers of something much darker, deeper. And there was one person in particular, who had taken keen interest in Mrs. Whitmore's retreat from the world, her stepson Leonard. From the window of the Red Hart Inn, Miss Marple observed him, standing tall in the village square, his sharp eyes scanning the streets with an almost predatory intensity. His self-assuredness, once a defining trait, now seemed laced with something else, something more calculating, more deliberate. And it wasn't until she saw them together that her suspicions were confirmed. At the far edge of the green, just beyond the baker's shop, Leonard stood with his stepmother, his posture stiff and commanding. He spoke in low tones, his voice barely audible, but his body language told a far more sinister story. His head tilted at an angle that suggested quiet insistence. Mrs. Whitmore, usually poised and unflappable, looked uncomfortable, her hands wringing together as she nodded quickly, almost too quickly, at something he said before hastily walking away, her footsteps quickening, as if she couldn't escape fast enough. Leonard remained behind, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had just stood, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line, as though something deep within him was simmering beneath the surface. Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly amiss. Leonard's eyes, cold and calculating, held no warmth of affection for his stepmother. He didn't look protective, he looked possessive, even dangerous. In the days that followed, the pattern became more apparent. At the grocer's, Leonard would chat with the shopkeeper, his charm effortlessly slipping into place, yet his gaze would often flick toward the door, as if waiting for someone, or perhaps avoiding someone. And at the churchyard, when Mrs. Whitmore knelt in prayer, Leonard's approach was unmistakable. Her body tensed before she swiftly rose and fled, as if the very sight of him triggered a silent alarm. It wasn't just the odd behavior, it was the subtle cues, the moments of discomfort, the way Mrs. Whitmore's posture stiffened whenever Leonard came near. It was the way her eyes darted nervously around, as if searching for an escape. Miss Marple had seen it all before, the tiny, unnoticed details that told the true story behind a carefully constructed facade. One afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk past Whitmore House, the heavy oak door firmly shut, but as she neared, she saw it, just a flicker of movement at the upstairs window. A shadow, too quick to be seen clearly, darted away as though someone had been watching her, tracking her every movement. By the time Miss Marple reached the post office, she had gathered enough to be certain. Leonard was watching his stepmother, and Mrs. Whitmore was terrified of him. The opportunity to speak with Mrs. Whitmore came unexpectedly, as Miss Marple was tending to the church's flower arrangements one morning. The door opened softly, and Mrs. Whitmore stepped inside, her gloved hands trembling ever so slightly as she lit a candle in the quiet of the nave. Miss Marple, with her usual serene demeanor, greeted her with a soft, "A beautiful morning, Mrs. Whitmore." The widow flinched at the sound of her voice, offering a strained, weak smile. "Yes, yes indeed," she replied, her words lacking their usual warmth. There was something about her, the way she carried herself as though weighed down by invisible chains. Miss Marple adjusted a sprig of lavender in the vase before continuing, her voice gentle but probing. "I was hoping to have a word with you, my dear." Miss Whitmore hesitated, her fingers tightening around her handbag, her body momentarily stiff. "It's about Mr. Lansbury," Miss Marple said, her tone light and casual. "The gentleman staying at the Red Hart. I believe you've made his acquaintance." For a fleeting moment, something dark flickered in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. too fast for any normal observer to notice. But not for Miss Marple. The widow's lips parted, but the words seemed caught in her throat, before she replied with a thin smile. I don't know him. But Miss Marple, with her keen eye, saw it all, the way Mrs. Whitmore's hands fumbled with her purse, the way her gaze darted nervously to the side. In that single moment, Miss Marple knew that something far more sinister was unfolding, and it had everything to do with the mysterious Mr. Lansbury, the controlling stepson Leonard, and the dark secrets hidden behind the walls of Whitmore House. The quiet town of Woodbridge was no longer what it seemed, and Miss Marple had every intention of unraveling the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. Mrs. Whitmore had always been the epitome of grace and composure, even in the face of adversity. Widowed and often the subject of village gossip, she had always carried herself with a dignity that earned her quiet respect. But lately Miss Marple had noticed a subtle shift. The once familiar sight of Mrs. Whitmore's morning strolls through the village square, exchanging pleasantries with shopkeepers and offering invites for tea, had faded into a conspicuous absence. Now the woman who had once been a central figure in Chipping Hollow's daily rhythm hardly ventured beyond the tall wrought iron gates of Whitmore House. It was a change that didn't go unnoticed. Villagers whispered, their curiosity growing by the day. "She's not herself anymore," Mrs. Partridge murmured, arranging fresh roses in the churchyard. "She used to be so friendly. Now she barely acknowledges anyone." Miss Marple merely adjusted her gloves, her eyes sharp, understanding that small disruptions in routine often pointed to larger disturbances beneath the surface, and one person in particular seemed to have noticed Mrs. Whitmore's withdrawal more than anyone. Her stepson, Leonard. Miss Marple, ever observant, had seen him several times at the Red Hart, his eyes scanning the square with attention that suggested something more than casual impatience. There was a cold calculation in his gaze that was hard to ignore. One day, by chance, Miss Marple spotted them together, near the baker's shop at the far end of the green. Leonard was speaking to Mrs. Whitmore in hushed tones, his posture stiff and insistent. The woman, typically poised, appeared unsettled, her hands clasped tightly, nodding stiffly at whatever he said before walking briskly away, her pace quickening, as if trying to distance herself. Leonard, however, remained rooted, his gaze fixed on the spot where she had just been, a thin line of frustration drawn across his mouth. The sight unsettled Miss Marple, who found herself puzzled by the dynamics between the two. A mother and son should share a protective bond. But there was something far more calculating in Leonard's eyes, something that made Miss Marple wary. Her suspicions deepened when she noticed Leonard's hand reach out toward his stepmother once more in the village square, only for Mrs. Whitmore to pull away just before his fingers could make contact. These were not the movements of a family in harmony, Miss Marple concluded, and her instincts told her that Leonard was watching his stepmother far too closely, perhaps with a far darker purpose in mind. Days later, as she strolled past Whitmore House, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the upstairs curtain, where a fleeting shadow hinted that someone had been watching her. By the time she reached the post office, a quiet certainty settled in her mind. Leonard was keeping a watchful eye on his stepmother, and Mrs. Whitmore, for reasons unknown, was afraid of him. The opportunity to speak with her came soon enough, as Mrs. Whitmore entered the church to light a candle, her hands trembling slightly as she lit the flame. "A lovely morning," Miss Marple remarked softly. Mrs. Whitmore, startled, gave a nervous smile. Yes indeed." There was an air of tension about her, the kind that suggested she was carrying a weight too heavy to bear. "I was hoping to speak with you, my dear," Miss Marple continued, watching the widow's expression shift. For a moment Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, her fingers tightening around her handbag. "About Mr. Lansbury," Miss Marple said, her tone light and casual, almost as if speaking of the weather. The widow stiffened, and Miss Marple saw it, the faint flicker of guilt in her eyes, quickly masked by a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm afraid I don't believe I had the pleasure," Mrs. Whitmore replied, though her voice trembled slightly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Odd," she mused aloud. "Several people seem to think they saw you speaking with him." Mrs. Whitmore's breath caught, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw the truth behind the woman's carefully constructed facade. Mrs. Whitmore knew Mr. Lansbury, and she was lying about it. The widow straightened, brushing the moment aside with practiced grace. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I must be getting home," she said, turning to leave. "Of course, dear," Miss Marple responded, her voice filled with the politeness of someone who knew much more than they let on. As Mrs. Whitmore hurried down the path, Miss Marple observed the tension in her shoulders, the quick, uneven steps. There was something being hidden, something she wasn't telling. The mystery deepened, and Miss Marple was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. In the coming days, the clues began to fall into place, leading her to a letter never delivered. Mr. Henry Fuller, the village postman, was the first to reveal the strange disappearance of a letter addressed to Mr. Lansbury. "Came through a week ago," he said, his tone casual, but with an edge of curiosity. "Never reached him though." Mrs. Thorne brought it back. "Vanished. No forwarding address. Nothing." Miss Marple's interest peaked. A letter from London, never delivered, arriving just before Lansbury's sudden disappearance. Something was amiss. The postman described it as official, not the kind of letter one would receive from friends or family, but a thick envelope, sealed with neat handwriting. A letter from London, with no return name, only an address. "Bloomsbury Way," Mr. Fuller said, his brow furrowing as he tried to recall the details. Miss Marple smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. It was all connected. Now more than ever, she was certain that Mr. Lansbury's disappearance was not a mere coincidence, and Mrs. Whitmore's role in it was far from innocent. As she made her way to the post office, she knew she was on the brink of something far deeper than she had originally suspected. Mr. Gregson, the postmaster, confirmed the strange return of the letter, his eyes lighting up with recognition when she mentioned it. Everything was falling into place, and Miss Marple was closing in on the truth. The unfolding mystery in Chipping Hollow was growing increasingly complex, its tangled threads drawing Miss Marple deeper into a web of secrets that had been carefully concealed for far too long. She sat quietly in her cozy sitting room, the morning sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, as her fingers delicately traced the edges of a letter she had received earlier. A letter from Landon and Myers, the prestigious London law firm. The firm had once handled the affairs of Albert Whitmore, the late husband of Mrs. Whitmore, a woman whose behavior had recently piqued Miss Marple's suspicions. What had once seemed like a series of isolated coincidences was now beginning to form a chilling pattern. The mysterious disappearance of Mr. Lansbury, a man who had arrived in Chipping Hollow only to vanish without a trace, was no random event. He had come here for a reason, perhaps to claim something, perhaps to make a connection with someone, but whatever his purpose, it had been swiftly and quietly eradicated, leaving nothing but questions in his wake. The key, Miss Marple was certain, lay in the letter that had been sent to him by Landon and Myers, sealed unopened, and returned undelivered. What had been so crucial in that letter that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it never reached its intended recipient? Mrs. Whitmore's lies about knowing Mr. Lansbury were becoming harder to ignore. She had been too careful, too guarded in her responses. And now the discovery of her late husband's association with the very law firm involved in Mr. Lansbury's mysterious affairs confirmed that the widow had much more to hide than she was willing to admit. As Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turned over the possibility that the letter from London was not just an ordinary communication, but one that carried the weight of a secret too dangerous to reveal. The paper, thick and formal, the neat handwriting that spoke of business dealings or legal matters, it all pointed towards something more than just a friendly correspondence. A legal claim, a hidden fortune, whatever it was, it had been meant for Mr. Lansbury. And now, with him gone, the truth remained locked away, its contents never to be known. But the mystery deepened even further when news of a body discovered in the river reached her ears. The village, already uneasy with the recent events, buzzed with whispered speculation. Miss Marple, sensing that this was no ordinary accident, hurried to the scene, her mind already racing ahead, piecing together the connections. The body had been found by the river, and the fisherman who had pulled it from the water stood apart from the crowd, a quiet figure whose tense posture suggested he understood the gravity of what had been uncovered. The villagers, ever eager for gossip but hesitant to speak openly, murmured nervously among themselves, but none dared to approach the fisherman directly. The body, cold and lifeless, was a stark reminder that someone, somewhere, had gone to extreme lengths to silence, not just Mr. Lansbury, but anyone who might have known too much. As Miss Marple took in the scene with a practiced eye, she noted the subtle details. The riverbank, still damp with the traces of the body's hasty removal, the way the fisherman's hands trembled ever so slightly as he stood, the worried expressions of the villagers, and the growing sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air. The body was no accident. This was murder, plain and simple, and it was part of a larger, more dangerous game that was being played in the shadows of Chipping Hollow. The pieces were falling into place, each revelation bringing her closer to the truth. Whoever had orchestrated the disappearance of Mr. Lansbury had not been content with simply erasing him from the village. Now they had taken it a step further, eliminating anyone who might threaten to expose their secrets. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she realized the full extent of the danger surrounding her. This was not just a case of a missing man or a tragic death. It was a carefully executed conspiracy, one that involved the highest levels of deception and manipulation. She could not afford to be complacent. Her every move, every word, had to be measured, for there were forces at play here far more dangerous than any she had encountered before. As Miss Marple walked back through the village, the weight of what she had learned settled heavily on her shoulders. Mrs. Whitmore's lies were no longer just an inconvenience. They were the first crack in a carefully constructed facade, one that would soon crumble under the pressure of Miss Marple's relentless pursuit of the truth. She had already written to an old acquaintance in London, a solicitor with a reputation for discretion and sharp insight into human nature. The reply had come swiftly. Landon and Myers, the law firm, had handled Mr. Whitmore's affairs years ago, and it was clear from the correspondence that there was something more to the connection between Mr. Lansbury and Mrs. Whitmore than anyone had realized. Miss Marple's suspicions grew stronger. Mr. Lansbury had not come to Chipping Hollow as a simple visitor. He had come as a man with a rightful claim, and that claim had been quietly suppressed before he could even read the letter that would have revealed it. The threads of this intricate puzzle were now tied together, and Miss Marple knew that only by pulling on them would the entire truth come to light. The widow's secrets, the mysterious letter, the body in the river, they were all part of a much larger story, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter what the cost. With every step she took, the village seemed to grow smaller, the walls closing in as she followed the delicate thread that would lead her to the truth. But in Chipping Hollow, truth was a rare and precious commodity, and Miss Marple knew that finding it would require not just sharp observation, but courage to face the darkness that lay hidden beneath the surface of this quiet, unsuspecting village. The game had only just begun, and the stakes were higher than ever before. As the crowd of onlookers gathered near the riverbank, their expressions became darker with each passing second. Constable Graves stood at the front, attempting, though with little success, to keep the curious villagers at bay. Their murmurs filled the air like an ominous undercurrent, the dreadful business unfolding before them too much to ignore. Mrs. Partridge, the widow who had become the talk of the village in recent weeks, stood nearby, her eyes wide with a mix of sorrow and unease. But there was something in her gaze that suggested a deeper concern, something that lurked beneath the surface. It was impossible to look away from the body that lay before them, pale, motionless, and partially covered by a coarse sheet, a tragic reminder of the life lost. The boots, the trousers, their cut unmistakably belonging to none other than Mr. Lansbury. The silence hung heavy in the air as a murmur passed through the village, each person grappling with their own version of the story. Dr. Townsend, the village's long-standing physician, stood at the edge of the gathered group, wiping the sweat from his brow as he addressed the gathering. Unfortunate accident, he declared with a note of finality in his voice. Most likely a slip on the riverbank. These things happen. His words, though seemingly comforting, lacked conviction. Miss Marple stood at the periphery of the crowd, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the handle of her handbag. Accidents indeed did happen, but there was something in the way Mr. Lansbury's body lay that felt too deliberate, too staged. She stepped forward, her expression soft but her tone sharp as a needle. "Forgive me, doctor," she began, her voice calm and respectful. "But has the time of death been determined?" Dr. Townsend's response came after a long pause, his eyes darting away as if searching for a lie that could be more palatable. "Difficult to say," he admitted reluctantly, his gaze falling to the ground as he adjusted his stance. "The water obscures certain details. Could have been a day or two ago. A day or two ago, precisely when Mr. Lansbury had disappeared without a trace." Miss Marple nodded slowly, as if processing the information, but her sharp mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of a puzzle that no one else seemed to notice. Her gaze dropped again to the body. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The body was far from the shallows, placed with a precision that suggested it had been placed there deliberately, not carried by the current as Dr. Townsend had suggested. And there was a disturbing lack of mud on his clothes, something that should have been inevitable for a man who had supposedly slipped into the river. Miss Marple's mind raced. To the villagers this was just another tragic accident, a moment of fate that couldn't have been avoided. But to Miss Marple, the scene before her reeked of something far more calculated, an elaborate deception designed to mislead, to confuse. Later that afternoon, as the village buzzed with whispers, Miss Marple found herself standing outside Dr. Townsend's surgery, watching him from a distance as he stood stiffly, lighting his pipe with deliberate care. She approached him slowly, her gait measured, her eyes never leaving him as she greeted him with her usual warm yet piercing smile. "Doctor," she began, her voice soft but laden with purpose. "I do hope the strain of the morning hasn't been too much for you, Doctor." Townsend exhaled slowly, his posture stiff and awkward, as though struggling to mask his unease. "A terrible thing, Miss Marple," he said, the words tumbling from his lips in a way that felt almost rehearsed. "Poor man must have lost his footing, taken an unlucky fall." "Unlucky indeed," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, but the underlying challenge in her tone was unmistakable. "And yet, I can't help but wonder, did you notice anything unusual, Doctor?" "Doctor." Townsend's fingers tapped nervously against the side of his pipe, his eyes flickering with an unspoken fear. "Not much, just the usual, you know. Same as any poor soul who finds himself in deep water," he muttered, as if trying to dismiss her inquiry without further thought. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she pushed forward. "I noticed his boots," she said, her voice thoughtful but edged with steel. "They were remarkably clean for a man who supposedly slipped on the muddy riverbank." "Doctor." Townsend stiffened, a nervous flicker in his eyes betraying him. "I suppose the water might have washed them," he stammered, his words less certain now. Miss Marple's lips curved into a small knowing smile. "And the bruising on his temple, the kind one might acquire before entering the water, not after." Dr. Townsend's grip on his pipe tightened, and Miss Marple could see the subtle shift in his posture. He was trying to maintain control, but the truth was slipping through his fingers. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice now lower, more guarded, "I assure you I examined the body thoroughly. Sometimes a fall is just a fall." His words were hollow, but they held an edge of desperation that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. She nodded, her smile never wavering, though she knew he was hiding something from her. As she turned to leave, her heart sank with the certainty that Dr. Townsend was lying. His reluctance to speak of the obvious told her everything she needed to know. And then, just as the day began to settle into twilight, the news reached Whitmore House, carried on the hushed voices of the villagers, and the soft murmurs of the staff who dared not speak too loudly in the presence of their mistress. By the time Miss Marple arrived for her afternoon visit, Mrs. Whitmore was already in a state of distress. The once elegant and composed woman now sat in her drawing room, pale as a ghost, trembling uncontrollably as she clutched an untouched cup of tea in her trembling hands. Her usual poise had completely deserted her. "It's dreadful," she whispered, her voice cracking as if she were speaking to herself more than to Miss Marple. "Truly dreadful." Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, her expression one of quiet concern. "You mustn't distress yourself, my dear," she said gently, her voice soft but laced with a quiet authority. "The village is already talking, But there's no need for you to worry. The truth will come to light soon enough. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes fluttered nervously, the facade of control that she had so carefully crafted over the years beginning to crumble. Miss Marple watched her closely, taking in every minute detail. The woman's nervousness, her inability to meet her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. There was something she wasn't telling her. The mystery, like the river itself, was deep, winding, and full of hidden currents. Miss Marple was determined to uncover them all. No matter how many lies were spun, no matter how many secrets were buried, she had already begun to piece together the truth. What seemed like a tragic accident was in reality a carefully crafted deception, and Miss Marple would not rest until every last thread of the mystery was unraveled. The truth was out there, hidden just beneath the surface. All she had to do was drag it into the light. It was a most unfortunate accident, Mrs. Whitmore murmured, her breath catching sharply as if the words themselves were painful. The involuntary reaction did not escape Miss Marple's keen eyes. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore faltered, her voice trembling as she spoke. An accident, of course. Miss Marple, ever so subtle, tilted her head slightly, her gaze fixed intently on the woman before her. You seem particularly affected by this news, she observed, her voice calm but cutting. Did you know Mr. Lansbury well? For a fleeting moment, something flickered in Mrs. Whitmore's eyes. Was it fear? Or perhaps the shadow of a long-buried secret? She shook her head a bit too quickly, as if trying to dismiss the thought. No, I hardly knew him at all, she stammered. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, let the silence stretch between them, allowing the weight of unspoken words to settle. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added quietly, "It must be terribly unsettling to know that the poor man was here just days ago." Mrs. Whitmore nodded, but her fingers tightened white-knuckled on the armrests of her chair, a barely visible sign of distress. "Yes," she whispered, the word barely audible. Another long pause hung in the air before she exhaled shakily. "Oh, Miss Marple, what a terrible thing death is. To think that a man can be here one moment, and gone the next." Miss Marple's hand gently rested on hers. "Yes, my dear," she said softly, her tone deceptively warm. "And sometimes it happens, not by accident, but by design." Mrs. Whitmore's hand flinched, pulling away slightly, her grip tightening ever so slightly before she withdrew altogether, her face pale. She didn't ask what Miss Marple meant. She didn't have to. The implication was enough to set Miss Marple's mind to work weaving through the subtle signs of deceit. Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple sipped tea with Mrs. Partridge, the unsettling news grew even more strange. "Mr. Fenton, the butler," Mrs. Partridge said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "He disappeared without a word. Not a single farewell. Just gone. Packed up and left yesterday. Like he vanished into thin air." Miss Marple, her gaze distant as she stirred her tea, raised an eyebrow. "Did he mention where he was going?" she asked. Mrs. Partridge shook her head. "Not a soul knows. He told Mrs. Whitmore he had personal matters to attend to. But between you and me, Jane, he left in a hurry. Too hurried, if you ask me." A suspicion stirred within Miss Marple. A man doesn't serve faithfully for decades, and then vanish without explanation, not unless he's hiding something that made him fear for his life. That evening, Miss Marple stood outside Whitmore House, the chill of the evening air biting at her skin as she was greeted by Edith, the anxious maid. "Terrible about Mr. Fenton, isn't it?" Miss Marple asked gently. Edith nodded, her face a mask of concern. "He weren't himself these last few days. Kept to himself, locked the pantry door at night, muttered about not wanting trouble." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he speak to Mrs. Whitmore before he left?" she asked. Edith hesitated, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Not in words, miss. But when he left, Mrs. Whitmore looked like she'd seen a ghost." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her mind already piecing the puzzle together. Mr. Fenton had been afraid, fearful of something he'd seen, something he wasn't willing to say aloud. Whatever it was connected to Mr. Lansbury's disappearance. The pieces were falling into place. Later, As the evening grew darker, Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Thorne at the Red Hart pub turned toward the missing man, the locked drawer, and a small but vital detail. "I believe there was a locked drawer in Mr. Lansbury's room," Miss Marple mentioned casually, her voice deceptively light. Mrs. Thorne started slightly, then nodded, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "I didn't want to go through his things," she said. "But after he disappeared, I thought it best to check." The drawer was locked tight. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with curiosity. "And you haven't had it opened?" she asked, a thread of suspicion in her tone. Mrs. Thorne hesitated, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "I did try," she admitted reluctantly. "I found a key amongst his things, but it didn't fit." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Odd," she murmured. "Might I have a look?" Moments later she stood in front of Mr. Lansbury's room. The air was thick with the weight of his absence, the room untouched since his disappearance. The writing desk stood like an untouched monument to a life interrupted, its lock gleaming in the dim light. Mrs. Thorne handed over a small brass key, the kind of key one might find in the coat pocket of a man who had suddenly disappeared. Miss Marple examined it carefully, her thoughts racing. There was more to this than met the eye. Mr. Lansbury's disappearance, Mr. Fenton's flight, and Mrs. Whitmore's odd behavior all pointed in one direction. Someone was hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The mystery of the locked drawer, the fear that clung to the house, and the missing butler were all part of a larger, more intricate web. A web that Miss Marple would untangle, piece by piece, until the truth was laid bare. Miss Marple's fingers hovered above the brass key, inspecting its shape with deliberate care before slipping it into the lock. A soft click echoed through the room, but the lock remained stubbornly shut. A small frown tugged at her lips as she ran her fingers across the metal, contemplating. If this key wasn't meant for the drawer, it had to be hidden somewhere else. The thought gnawed at her. If Mr. Lansbury had hidden it, he must have known something was coming. With the same quiet determination that had guided her through countless mysteries, she moved across the desk, her eyes sweeping over the room. A glint of something behind a row of travel books caught her attention. Pulling the books aside, she discovered a small envelope, its edges frayed slightly from being tucked away. Inside was a second, smaller key. This one fit the lock without resistance. With a soft sigh, she turned the drawer's handle. Inside, hidden beneath neatly stacked papers, was a leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with tight, precise handwriting. Miss Marple opened the first page, her eyes scanning the title, "The Whitmore Estate, The Truth Behind My Claim." She closed the book slowly, her thoughts racing. Mr. Lansbury hadn't come to Chipping Hollow by accident. He had been investigating something far more dangerous than a mere estate. He had been unraveling a truth someone desperately wanted buried. Her fingers turned the pages with reverence, as the entries became increasingly detailed. It was clear now. Mr. Lansbury was documenting his search for the truth, tracing every clue, every lid. The more she read, the more the weight of the discovery pressed upon her. At the center of it all was one name, Albert Whitmore. As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Lansbury hadn't just been a passing visitor. He had a claim to the Whitmore estate, a claim that had been erased from the final will. The entries in the notebook revealed discrepancies in Albert Whitmore's will, changes made in the months before his death. One entry stood out in particular. Last amendment dated 3 months before his passing. Contradictions in final version. Primary beneficiary altered. The sentence ended abruptly, as if something had forced Mr. Lansbury to stop. The implications were clear. Someone had wanted him to stop investigating, to silence him. But it was too late. The truth was now in Miss Marple's hands. One name struck her next. Peter Lansbury. Her breath caught in her chest. Mr. Lansbury had not been an outsider. He had been a rightful heir to the Whitmore estate, someone with a claim that had been wiped from the final will. The realization hit her like a storm. Someone had been willing to kill to keep that truth buried. As Miss Marple closed the notebook, a wave of determination washed over her. The truth had nearly been lost with Mr. Lansbury's death. But now it would come to light. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. And she knew the next steps were critical. Later that afternoon, she found herself seated in the dimly lit drawing room of Whitmore House, where Mrs. Whitmore sat hunched over, a pale shadow of the woman she once was. The elegant, composed matron seemed fragile now, her hands shaking as she clutched a handkerchief. Miss Marple's gaze softened as she sat across from her, offering no judgment, only quiet patience. The truth had been pushing on Mrs. Whitmore for days, pulling at her sanity, and now it had to be revealed. Mrs. Whitmore finally spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. I knew exactly who he was. She breathed, her words trembling in the heavy air. Miss Marple nodded gently, waiting for her to continue. Mr. Lansbury. Mrs. Whitmore's voice cracked. Peter was my husband's son, born before we were married. Albert never spoke of him, not to anyone in the village. It was a secret, something he thought best left forgotten. The room seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple's mind raced. The threads were all converging. The will, the secret heir, the bloodline. And now as the darkness of the past closed in, Miss Marple knew the storm was about to break. Whitmore's confession was only the beginning, and the truth would soon come to claim all of them. The game of cat and mouse had only just begun, and Miss Marple had already set her sights on the next move. Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on Mrs. Whitmore, whose trembling hands clutched a handkerchief, as if it were a lifeline. The once proud woman now seemed like a fragile shadow of her former self, broken by the weight of the secrets she could no longer keep. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, yet it held the unbearable truth that Miss Marple had suspected all along. I knew, Mrs. Whitmore murmured, her gaze distant as memories surged to the forefront of her mind. I knew exactly who he was. Miss Marple did not rush her, allowing the words to surface at their own pace, like a slow and painful unearthing. Albert had sent money to Peter over the years, a quiet acknowledgement of his existence. But when Albert's health began to falter, everything changed. He wanted to set things right. Mrs. Whitmore continued, the quiet admission more telling than any confession. He changed his will, naming Peter as his rightful heir. The words hung in the air like a bombshell, and Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, patient. And then Mrs. Whitmore's voice faltered. 3 months before he died, he changed it back. Miss Marple's eyes never wavered, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. She could hear the weight of Mrs. Whitmore's sorrow, the regret in her tone. Leonard, Albert's son from another life, had been the one to intervene, driven by greed and a burning need to protect his inheritance. He found out, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice quivering, her gaze far away. Peter had evidence, documents, letters, proof that Albert intended to provide for him. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. And Leonard couldn't have that. He couldn't let Peter take what he felt was rightfully his. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to Mrs. Whitmore's clenched hands, the pale fingers still gripping the handkerchief with almost painful force. So he silenced him. Miss Marple murmured softly, the certainty in her voice unmistakable. You don't know that for sure, Mrs. Whitmore protested weakly. But even she could not deny the terrible truth. The room fell into heavy silence, and Miss Marple could almost feel the weight of the unspoken secrets pressing in on them both. Her life had been taken to preserve an inheritance, and now Miss Marple knew exactly where to look for the truth. Murder, she thought, was never as flawless as it appeared. Even the most meticulous killers overlooked one critical detail: human nature. As she sat in the dim room, her mind racing, she began to connect the dots with unnerving clarity. Peter Lansbury's death had not been an accident. It had been carefully orchestrated, and the facts were all in front of her. Mr. Lansbury had a rightful claim to the Whitmore estate, one that Leonard had been desperate to erase. The letter from Landon and Myers had made it clear. Peter had come to Chipping Hollow to reclaim what was his. But Leonard had known the truth long before that, and when Peter had arrived, he must have realized exactly why. The lock drawer had held the evidence, a legal paper trail that Mr. Lansbury had gathered, showing Albert's original intent to provide for his son, before Leonard's influence had altered the will. The bruising on Peter's temple had been the final clue. Dr. Townend had hesitated to speak on it. But it wasn't from a fall. It was from a blow. The butler, Mr. Fenton, had seen something. Something that had scared him enough to flee. Miss Marple's breath escaped in a quiet sigh. The pieces were falling into place. Peter had come to reclaim his birthright. And Leonard had feared the truth would come out. Faced with the prospect of losing everything, Leonard had made a deadly choice. He had silenced Peter, staged the scene, and then cast him into the river, hoping to erase any trace of his crime. But as Miss Marple sat there, notebook in hand, the pieces of the puzzle clicked together in her mind. She knew the truth now. Peter had been murdered, not by chance, but by design. And someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the Whitmore estate would remain under their control, no matter the cost. The atmosphere in the Red Art Inn was thick with tension, as Miss Marple, with her usual calm demeanor, orchestrated the gathering with remarkable finesse. The key figures, Mrs. Whitmore, Leonard, Constable Graves, Dr. Townsend, and a handful of unsuspecting villagers, sat in a loose circle, their conversations light but laced with an underlying strain. Whitmore, sitting stiffly by the fireplace, kept her hands tightly folded in her lap, her gaze distant, as though she were preparing herself for something inevitable. Leonard, ever the picture of feigned ease, hovered near the bar, his fingers nervously tapping against the counter. It was an unassuming affair on the surface. But Miss Marple knew better. She had arranged it all with the quiet precision of a conductor leading her orchestra into a crescendo of revelation. The talk, almost absent-minded, turned to the unfortunate demise of Mr. Lansbury, his drowning, the tragedy of it, how he'd been found. Miss Marple, ever the master of subtlety, sipped her tea, and offered a knowing smile, but the glint in her eye betrayed the storm that was about to break. Yes, she mused aloud. Such a dreadful accident indeed. But there are peculiarities, don't you think? Details that simply don't add up. The room stilled, the air thick with anticipation, as all eyes turned toward her. Leonard's posture shifted slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice light. But there was no mistaking the tension in his words. She placed her teacup down with an almost inaudible clink, her gaze never wavering from Leonard's. "Oh, just the little things, Leonard. The locked drawer in Mr. Lansbury's room. The letter that never reached him. And of course," she paused, her lips curling into a faint smile, "the rather significant changes to your father's will." Silence descended like a weight, Mrs. Whitmore's breath catching in her throat, while Leonard's expression darkened for the briefest moment, just enough for Miss Marple to see the flicker of guilt. Leonard chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "Miss Marple, I hardly think." "But you do think, Leonard." Miss Marple interjected softly. "You thought very carefully indeed. You thought about what would happen if Mr. Lansbury proved his claim to the Whitmore estate, didn't you? How it would leave you with very little." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gathered company. Mrs. Whitmore shut her eyes briefly, bracing herself for the truth that was now inevitable. Leonard's face twisted with anger, his voice sharp. "I don't know what you're suggesting," he spat. Miss Marple gave a gentle sigh, her tone unwavering. "Oh, but you do. Murder is never as neat as one hopes. You see." She turned her gaze to Dr. Townsend, who was seated across the room, his discomfort palpable. "Doctor, would you be so kind as to remind us where exactly the bruising was found on Mr. Lansbury's body?" Dr. Townsend hesitated, his throat constricting before he cleared it. "On his temple," he said, his voice strained, as though he had been struck before entering the water. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes never leaving Leonard. "And tell me, Leonard, how does a man who slips and falls strike his head first before drowning?" Leonard's jaw clenched, his face growing pale. Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but resolute. "No, Leonard. Mr. Lansbury did not fall. He was struck, stunned, and then placed in the water to make it appear as though he had drowned accidentally. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Ridiculous. Leonard hissed, his voice rising. You have no proof of that. Oh, but I do. Miss Marple replied sweetly. Mr. Lansbury's boots, Leonard. They were clean. No mud. No sign of slipping down a wet embankment. No sign that he walked to his own death. Mrs. Whitmore's sob caught in her throat, the weight of the revelation finally too much for her to bear. Enough, she cried out, her voice breaking. It's over. Leonard turned to her, fury etched across his face. Mother, don't. Stop lying, she interrupted, her voice shaking with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. I saw you that night. I saw you return. Your clothes wet. The words hung in the air, unsaid but unmistakable. The truth had surfaced, unstoppable and undeniable. The heavy weight of silence hung in the air as Leonard stood there, his face pale, lips trembling. The room, once filled with innocent chatter, had now become a charged battlefield. Every eye on him, waiting for the truth to unravel. Miss Marple, ever so composed, had guided the conversation with precision, her gentle hand steering them toward the heart of the mystery. Leonard's discomfort grew palpable as the focus shifted, ever so subtly, towards the fateful night of Peter Lansbury's death. Mrs. Whitmore sat rigid, her eyes flicking nervously from one face to another, while Leonard, though trying to appear at ease, couldn't mask the tension in his shoulders, or the nervous tapping of his fingers on the bar counter. The room fell into an uncomfortable stillness, as Miss Marple's voice broke through, soft but cutting. It was an accident, wasn't it? A tragic accident. Yet the details don't add up, do they? Her words hung in the air like a cloud ready to burst. Mrs. Whitmore's breath caught in her throat, and Leonard's face darkened. He tried to laugh it off, but his gaze betrayed him. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, didn't relent. You see, Leonard, the bruising on Mr. Lansbury's temple, and the clean boots, no mud, no signs of a fall, and then the will, so conveniently altered just before his death. The room was dead silent now, every word sinking into the hearts of those present. Leonard, though desperate to maintain composure, couldn't stop the flicker of panic in his eyes. Mrs. Whitmore's hands shook as she clutched the armrest, and in that fleeting moment, she saw the truth. Leonard's facade shattered. You killed him, didn't you? Mrs. Whitmore's voice broke, the words tasting like poison on her tongue. You killed your own brother. A sharp gasp echoed, and Leonard staggered back, his face drained of color, his mind racing for a way out. But there was no escape. Constable Graves moved forward, steady and unwavering, his voice cutting through the chaos. Leonard Whitmore, I'm afraid you'll have to come with me. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. But then, in a burst of desperation, Leonard lunged for the door, knocking over chairs, and in a flash, he was gone, racing into the night, fueled by guilt, fear, and a need to flee from his own truth. Miss Marple didn't flinch. She knew the course of justice couldn't be avoided, no matter how fast you ran. Constable Graves was on his heels, and the chase was over before it even started. Within minutes, Leonard was returned, breathless and defeated, his face a mask of regret and hopelessness. The battle had ended, but the cost was high. You shouldn't have run, lad, Graves muttered as he cuffed Leonard, his voice laced with a hint of sorrow. It only makes you look guiltier. Leonard's hollow laugh echoed, his spirit shattered. I suppose that's the least of my worries now. Miss Marple observed him, her gaze steady and unwavering. Justice moves forward, Leonard, whether you run or not. As Constable Graves led Leonard away, Miss Marple's words lingered in the room like an echo. Mrs. Whitmore, now alone, trembled, her grief etched deep in her eyes. Miss Marple placed a hand gently on hers, offering comfort in the only way she knew how. It's over now, my dear. But both knew that some wounds don't heal with the passage of time. And for Mrs. Whitmore, the weight of the truth would linger long after justice had been served. The villagers left in hushed whispers, but Miss Marple remained seated, her mind turning over the case as the flames flickered in the hearth. Another case closed, another tragedy uncovered, but in her heart, she knew that the truth had a way of moving, like a river carving its path through rock, and sometimes, it took the fiercest storms to expose it. The next morning, Whitmore House stood silent, its walls heavy with secrets. Mrs. Whitmore, summoned to the drawing room, sat like a shadow of her former self, her hands trembling as she gripped the teacup. The truth, at last, was out. "I knew," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I knew what Leonard had done, and I said nothing." The weight of her own silence was a burden she could never shed. The night of Peter's disappearance replayed in her mind. Leonard's return home, his clothes damp, his eyes hollow with guilt. "I asked him," she continued, her voice barely audible, what had happened. But he lied. He always lied. The air around Mrs. Whitmore was thick, dense with the weight of unspoken truths. As she sat there, trembling, unable to escape the suffocating silence of her own mind, her once steady hands shook, fingers lightly tracing the edge of the table, as though the surface could ground her from the storm inside. She swallowed hard, her breath shallow, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. I knew everything." The confession hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy with regret and fear, each word a small unraveling of the life she thought she had known. She looked away, unable to meet Miss Marple's gaze, as though the simple act of looking at her would force her to confront the truth she had spent so long denying. Her eyes, once sharp and calculating, now shimmered with a blend of guilt and sorrow, a reflection of all the years she had spent hiding in plain sight. "I knew he was capable of anything. Leonard, my son. I should have stopped him before it went too far, but I didn't. I chose to ignore it." Her voice faltered, and she quickly wiped away the tears that had begun to fall, her face a mask of sorrow. "All these years, I thought if I remained silent, it would protect me, protect us. But look at where it's gotten me. Now I'm left with nothing, no family, no future, only these regrets." The last word trembled in her throat, as if the very act of speaking it was a release of a burden she could no longer carry. Miss Marple, ever the observer, did not offer her the comfort of false reassurances. Instead, she simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "It doesn't make you guilty, Mrs. Whitmore," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "But it does mean you must live with it. The silence, the choices you made, it will be your burden to carry." Her words were not harsh, but they were heavy, and Mrs. Whitmore knew they were true. She had lived her life pretending, hiding from the consequences of her actions, and now there was no escaping the inevitable. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes welled with fresh tears, and she clenched her fists in her lap, trying to steady herself. "I don't know what to do now. Everything I've ever known is gone." Her voice was barely audible, as though speaking any louder would shatter her remaining composure. Miss Marple's hand reached out, gentle and firm, placing a reassuring touch on hers. "The truth is never easy, Mrs. Whitmore, but it's the only thing that remains when everything else falls away. You can no longer hide from it, nor can it hide from you." The simplicity of Miss Marple's words, though gentle, held a harsh truth that Mrs. Whitmore could no longer deny. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village of Chipping Hollow, Miss Marple made her way out into the streets. The village, as it always did, seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. The gossip already began to swirl, like a whirlpool slowly drawing everyone into its pull, transforming the tragedy of the Whitmore family into a story, a cautionary tale. And just as the river continued to flow, so too did the lives of the people here, unaware of how quickly time moved on, carrying the weight of their secrets with it. Miss Marple paused by the riverbank, watching the water as it rippled steadily in the fading light. She wondered how many secrets it had carried away, how many crimes had been washed beneath its surface, never to be seen again. The river, so calm on the outside, was a silent witness to the darkness that had unfolded in the village. How many lives had been touched by deceit and betrayal? How many times had the truth been ignored, buried beneath a veil of comfort and denial? She thought of Leonard, of his greed and entitlement, and of the man he had become. He had believed that his birthright was more than a simple inheritance. It was a tool, a means to an end. But he had underestimated the power of consequence. For all his cunning, he had not understood that true cleverness was not about getting away with murder, but about knowing when to stop, when to turn back. And Leonard, like so many others before him, had not known when to stop. The quiet reflection took her back to Mrs. Whitmore's confession. She had been neither wholly innocent nor wholly guilty. Like so many before her, she had believed that silence could protect her. But silence, Miss Marple knew, was a dangerous thing. It created shadows where the truth could not reach, and those shadows grew longer with time. Eventually, they consumed everything. As she walked away from the river, heading back toward the heart of the village, Miss Marple's mind turned toward the nature of crime itself. It wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic murders. Sometimes, the most destructive crimes were the ones no one ever noticed. The small betrayals, the little lies whispered in the dark, the moments when silence was chosen over truth. It was the secrets that people kept, the ones they thought no one would ever uncover, that truly defined the darkness of the human soul. She often wondered how many crimes went unnoticed, lurking in plain sight, unnoticed until someone came along to pull them into the light. Turning back to the village, she knew that the search for justice was never truly over. There would always be another crime, another truth to uncover. It was the way the world worked. Truth was elusive, ever shifting, always just out of reach. And as long as there were secrets to be discovered, she would be there, chasing them down, refusing to let them remain hidden. The morning air was crisp as she prepared to leave Chipping Hollow, her travel bag packed, her hat neatly set at its usual angle. She looked out over the village one last time, the bustle of life continuing in its usual rhythm. And she knew that, for better or for worse, life would go on here, as it always had. But for Miss Marple, the journey was never truly over. There would always be another village, another case, another mystery to solve. And she would never stop seeking the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. The truth, after all, had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it was buried. And Miss Marple, with her quiet determination, would always be there to uncover it. Partridge was leaning toward her neighbor, her voice low yet filled with an animated urgency, recounting the events of the past few days with an energy that bordered on theatrical. Her hands moved expressively, no doubt exaggerating some of the details for effect, ensuring her audience was captivated by the drama. Not far from her, Mr. Abbott, the grocer, was stacking crates outside his shop. Every now and then, he'd pause, his gaze drifting to the passing villagers, exchanging knowing glances and subtle nods. His expression seemed to say it all, a silent understanding among the townsfolk that life was returning to its predictable rhythm. Yes, the village would settle back into its usual routine, but the whispers, those insidious whispers, would never truly disappear. The murmur of one crime, of one scandal, would fade away only to be replaced by the next, like a tide that never ceased its flow. Miss Marple, as she walked toward the station, could almost hear those whispers in the air, swirling around her, just beneath the surface of the everyday bustle. She reached the platform where Constable Graves was already standing, his hat in hand, his stance awkward yet respectful. He nodded in her direction, his voice gruff but sincere. "Thought I'd see you off, Miss Marple," he said, a slight chuckle in his tone. "Can't say I expected quite so much excitement when you arrived. Didn't realize you'd stir up so much trouble in such a quiet place." Miss Marple offered a small knowing smile. "Oh, my dear Constable," she replied softly, I never cause excitement. I merely observe. Graves let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Well, either way, Miss Marple. You've done us all a service. Can't have men like Leonard Whitmore thinking they're above the law. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant for a moment. No indeed, she murmured. But I do wonder, Constable, how many such crimes go unseen, simply because no one cares to look closely enough. Graves frowned at her words, pondering the weight of them. You think there are more? He asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, serene, almost placid. Oh, there are always more, dear boy, she replied, her tone soft yet filled with an unspoken certainty. But the truth has a way of making itself known, eventually, whether we want it to or not. The station bell rang, signaling the approaching train. As the steam rose into the chilly morning air, Mrs. Whitmore appeared on the platform. She moved with an air of quiet resignation, her steps slower than before. There was something different about her now, her posture less stiff, her face carrying the weight of an emotional burden, something between grief and reluctant acceptance. Miss Marple, she said, her voice soft and unsure, her eyes brimming with unspoken words. I just wanted to thank you. Miss Marple offered a gentle, almost maternal smile. There's no need, my dear. The truth would have surfaced with or without me. Mrs. Whitmore swallowed hard, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Perhaps, but I might never have had the courage to face it, had you not been there. Miss Marple reached out, her touch light but steady. Then let us call it a kindness, she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. As the train's whistle blew in the distance, signaling its imminent departure, Miss Marple stepped onto the train, but not before she cast one final glance at the village of Chipping Hollow. The sight of the villagers, caught in the ever-churning tide of gossip, the quiet tension in the air, was all too familiar. There, standing alone on the platform, was Mrs. Whitmore, a woman who had faced the crushing weight of her own secrets, and yet, in the end, had been liberated by them. Miss Marple knew that life here, as in every village, would return to normal, would adjust to the silence left in the wake of the truth. The past would eventually settle, as it always did, but somewhere, perhaps in another quiet town, another mystery was already beginning to unfold. Another cup of tea would soon be poured, another tale of deception, another twisted story, waiting for someone to uncover it. And Miss Marple, as always, would be ready.